Now we're going to have Shane Meadows telling you all about This Is England. Hello, Shane.
Hello there.
And also, we also have with you the star of the movie, who's Tomo Turgoose. Hello, Tomo.
Hello.
How are you, sir?
Okay.
Good. Okay. Well, let's go through this. First of all, first point, which I think people will sit there, Shane, as they're taking in your movies. What a fantastic soundtrack. Can I have a copy, please, as I leave the cinema?
Yeah, they are releasing the soundtrack, which is a great thing. It didn't look like it was going to happen at one point, which would have been a tragedy, I think. It's got some absolutely classic Trojan skinhead music on there and a nice mix of 80s with some Ludovico Einaudi pieces that were composed for the film just for an extra bonus. So it's quite a soundtrack, you're right.
Yeah, so give us an outline of your story for This Is England.
Yeah, basically, I mean, a lot of the work that I've done to date's been sort of semi-autobiographical, but this is probably the closest thing to my own life growing up in Uttoxeter in the early 80s. It's about a young kid who is walking around with straggly hair and reindeer jumpers on, getting preyed on and picked on at school, and ultimately joins a local skinhead gang. But it's a skinhead gang who are actually into the original skinhead scene, which is, basically into the Trojan reggae, and they know their roots and where they're from. And it's all about the transition of that kid of getting involved in, the skinhead culture for the right reasons and the original reasons, and having his head turned by a more dominant character who tries to sort of bring the national front into their community.
Now, this skinhead culture that you're talking about, Shane, is interesting because it's not normally when you have skinheads in a movie, it's usually a 70s movie, and it isn't this kind of second wave of skinheads. You've touched on some of the differences. Do you just want to explain what the difference is?
Yeah, I mean, basically, when I looked around at the films that had been made, I suppose the films that were memorable, I mean, American History X, Romper Stomper and Made in Britain, all seem to paint a picture of skinheads as a far more sort of extreme right-wing fascist and racist organisation, if you like. And I knew from growing up at my time in the early 80s that the skinheads I was hanging around with initially were actually really aware of the fact that skinhead movement was born out of a love of Jamaican music in the late 60s, and the original movement of skinheads actually came about by working class white and black lads working together in factories, shipyards, docks, and actually going to each other's clubs, white lads going to blues parties and hearing Jamaican music for the first time. So how it could have ended up being perceived as only people remembering the racist or fascist side of that movement, I thought was a real tragedy. And I didn't want to tell people. I said to people I used to be a skinhead, and they assume I used to be a racist, and I didn't want that to be how skinhead culture was remembered, because it wasn't like that from my point of view.
I still think people will be surprised, Shane, just to see that other side of skinhead culture. I mean, for example, here's a text from Doug in Birmingham. I hope you're going to congratulate Shane for doing something to dispel the myth that skinheads are racist. I wasn't a skinhead, but I knew a lot of them in the 80s. None of them were racist, and they were much more interested in music than politics. Don't confuse them with the bald racists.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that, that there's so many lasting images of skinheads doing Nazi salutes and things that make better press, and I suppose make more memorable images than a white and a black skinhead playing pool at a youth club. The press, I don't know, seem to have wanted skinheads to have been remembered. I don't know, who's to blame for that, or whether it's just the imagery is so much more vivid from the sort of fascist side. But it was something that, like a lot of us, in the second wave, we still understood where it had come from. And I think, that the skinhead, the whole thing of being born out of a love of black music, for it to be remembered how it seems to be remembered now, was a crime in my eyes.
I think one of the interesting things, I mean, as you know, Simon, as you know, Shane, I'm a huge fan of This Is England. I think it's a really terrific piece of work. But one of the interesting things about the skinhead culture that Shane's talking about is it's much more class orientated than anything else. I mean, I remember, when I was a kid, there was no. I'm a middle class kid. There was no possibility of being a skinhead. You could only be a skinhead if you were working class. But I think that's true, Shane. I mean, I ended up being a rockabilly because that's what the middle class kids were.
Completely, yeah. I agree with that wholeheartedly, and that was put across in the 80s as it was in the late 60s. It was, especially in the 80s, it took on a new resonance, because if you were being told, either coming out of school or when you'd left school, that the only thing available to you was to work in a biscuit factory, or you were going to be a bin man and you're going to sweep the streets because you haven't got the qualifications. To be a skinhead, it wasn't like being a mod where you had to have the money to buy a zoot suit and a scooter. To be a skinhead, all you needed was a pair of jeans, work boots, a white shirt and a shaved head, and it was all about being proud of being working class. It was certainly nothing at that point to do with disliking ethnic minorities.
Explain, Shane, the importance of your central character, and we'll talk to Tomo in just a moment, but a really tough role for for a 12, 13-year-old to tackle. What were you looking for?
I mean, at first I thought I was going to need to get a kid from a workshop or a drama group, someone that had got some experience but was maybe from a similar background to myself. But after trawling the country for 3 or 4 months, we realised that it was going to need to be someone much more in that mould of like the kid from Kes. We needed someone that maybe had never acted before, because it needed to be someone that was almost living that life at the same time. And I met Tomo was actually found by a specialist street caster, and when we spoke to him initially and asked him if he'd got, if he'd ever played any parts even in school plays, he told me that he'd just been turned down for a school play. You might be able to tell me what part it was, Tom. It was a non-speaking part, wasn't it?
I think it was just stood there, just waving.
And you got turned down?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the thought of giving him a lead in a film after he got turned down for that was one that I thought would have been fantastic, after the school hadn't even spotted him as a waving type person.
But this is kind of crucial, Shane, is it? Because he's in every scene, Tomo.
Yeah, and that was when I sort of decided to cast him, and he wasn't at school full time at the time, and the centre that he was at, there was like a drop-in centre called, is it the Space Project, Tomo? Yeah. He was there a lot of the time, and so it was quite a gamble, just in terms of, if I'd had 6 months to turn him around and, to sort of get him used to working those hours, for anybody it's going to be difficult, but for Tom, who was only, doing a few hours a day at school, it was a gamble, but it obviously paid off, and he proved himself that with the right kind of input, and that's what scared me at the end of this, is I kind of thought, well, yes, we've made a difference to Tomo's life and he's proved what he's capable of, but how many people are slipping through the net, and that was one of the most frightening aspects of doing the casting, that, we can only really go out in this film and take one person and sort of, give them the input, but there's so many others that, seem to be possibly getting, like I was at myself at school, no one seemed to see what I was capable of, and that's kind of a scary thought.
But he does carry the movie, for a large part of it, and Shane, you told me that there was a moment during filming one of the more difficult scenes, because some of the scenes in the film are difficult to, I imagined, hard to watch, but I imagine difficult to film, in which you said, and Tomo, you can possibly, back this up or contradict it, that Tomo actually had a conversation with you and said, I don't know whether I can do this.
You tell him, Tom, yeah.
Well, at first I found it really hard to sort of continue with working on my own in so many hours and just not having any other kids around to mess about with or just have a laugh. And I said to Shane, I don't know whether I can carry on doing it because I'm getting a bit bored and I'm finding it hard. And he said to me that he had another kid on standby. So I
Did you?
Yeah.
No.
I thought, no one else is having it, it's mine now. And him and Shane promised to take me to town and do some shopping and just have a laugh about it, and which I never did. But
we gave you some rollerblades or something, didn't we?
Yeah. And he just promised me that it'd get a lot easier when all the other cast started coming in, like Joe Gilgun and Pukey, Jack O'Connell and people like that. It started getting a lot better when there was people my age there.
Having been turned down for that extra role, walking on and waving, and you clearly would deem not good enough for that, what do you think, Tom, what did you think about then being offered the lead role in this extraordinary film?
I thought that I would, I don't really know, really.
Must have turned your head.
I just thought that, why didn't they sort of cast me in like a little play like that, and then what they'll think now by saying no to me for that little part after they've seen This Is England, it'll just be different.
How did you remember all the words? Did you spend, if you weren't actually on camera, you spend most, as you said, you're in almost every shot. There are an awful lot of lines for you to remember.
Well, it wasn't lined, it was improvisation, and Shane had sort of put a scene in front of us and tell us to sort of put it into our own words and things like that, but Joe Hartley, Shane had sort of give us the call sheet for the day after what we'd just finished, and he'd give us the scenes that we was doing, and me and Joe Hartley would go through it, because I used to spend quite a lot of time with Joe Hartley.
She played your mum in the film, didn't she?
Yeah.
How much of this character, Shane, changed once Thomas had got his hands on the character?
Well, I think it was in parts. I mean, Tomo kind of really is me at that age. I mean, obviously being brought up in Grimsby and seeing Grimsby compared to Toxteth, I mean, I think it's probably a bit harder being brought up there, and you probably don't get the same amount of chances that maybe I got. And one of the things I said to Tomo when I went into his caravan that day when he was thinking of giving up was, I know you probably hear this all the time, but this may be the only sort of chance that you get. I'd probably had 3 or 4 chances in my life, and so I think although we were very similar, I think modern life for kids now, there's a lot more to drag people down. Even just silly things like computers and internet and games, and there's at least when I was a kid we were out there doing something. And so I think although we are incredibly similar as people, there was differences. And the fact that Tomo was just living with his mum at the time, and him and his father were estranged at that particular point in time, those things bled into the film. My parents were always there when I was brought up, but as you see from the film, Sean's character actually doesn't have a father in the film at that particular point in time, and became one of the cruxes and one of the main themes in the film. So I do tend to meet people, and like with this character, it's probably 80 or 90% based on my own experience, but I'd have been crazy not to allow some of Tomo's life to work its way in there, because he was so similar to me.
It's been given an 18 certificate. You wanted a 15 certificate, as I understand it. Watching the film last night, Shane, I kind of understand where the argument is. I can see your point in wanting people to go and see it, but also because of the racial nature of some of the violence and the threatened violence, you can understand why the BBFC might have thought maybe we need to hold out here.
I get it. I think the problem is that the nature of there's one violent scene, physically violent scene in the film, and there's one emotionally, racially charged violent scene. And from my point of view, if someone can get a 15 certificate with 20 or 30 slayings in a film, which no one feels any consequence of, heads being chopped off, heads rolling down, snakes on a plane, Jeepers Creepers, these films are horrifically violent. And I think the problem is that because my violence is real, and because the violence in my films is very minimal but very affecting, for me, I've done a great job if I can show one person being beaten up in a film and make them care about a generation of problems. That's a real achievement for me. The fact that it's been pulled down on that, I know that there's pirate copies that exist out there. People will, if they can't go and see it in the cinema, they'll go and watch it on a pirate. It's not like they won't see the film. So what they're actually doing isn't actually changing anything. The only difference is that obviously there's a lot of people that could have sat and watched it in a cinema, and also paid for Tomo's college degree, and they're not doing that now. Someone from a car boot sales getting the funds of that.
But it is worth pointing out, Shane, that as far as I know, Bristol Council have officially overturned the certificate, and they've given it a 15 of their own. And I understand that other councils are individually looking at it, because again, as Simon was saying, the BBF, there is an argument from the BBFC's side, and I think the BBFC wrestled with it, but the councils seem to be much more sympathetic towards saying, this should be seen by teenagers.
Yeah, I think you've got to look at the intentions of the film, and I think there's some films out there with the nature of acute violence in this, and I don't think it's obviously about the amount of violence that's in there.
No, because there's very little.
Yeah, and I kind of obviously I understand it to a degree, but I think the fact that it's the tragedy's been, I don't think Grimsby overturned it, and I don't think Nottingham overturned it, and I don't think Sheffield overturned it. And obviously it was made out of Nottingham and Sheffield, and obviously Tomo's from Grimsby, so that's a tragedy really, that 80% of the cast were 15 or whatever when we made it, and they were from Nottingham. So the fact that our own sort of county don't even think kids who were in there and were part of it should be able to show it to their peers, I think it's crazy. But like you say, it's nice that a few people have, because it goes to show that there's an argument both ways. It's not an easy call. I'm not saying it was obviously a 15, but at the same time, kids have moved on, even from what I was doing at 14 or 15 years old, and I was watching Texas Chainsaw Massacre. You found a way when you were a kid to watch these films, and the difference is, I think it's much better that people are watching it officially in a cinema than round at some dodgy flat, so I think it's a bit of a shame.
We were speaking just before to movie director Shane Meadows, who's directed This Is England, stars Tomo Turgoose, and Mark Kermode is here. Just before the news, Shane, we were discussing this fact that it's been given an 18 certificate, but that some councils have overturned it, given a 15. Is that obviously you want it to be a 15, obviously you want more people to see it, but is that an entirely proper way of going about things? I don't see what the point of having the BBFC is about if local councils can just say, do you know what, we're going to give it a different certificate because we think so.
Well, I think that it's in place because it tends to actually go the other way round, that if the BBFC make a recommendation for a 15 and the local councils think that it should be an 18, they can also do it in that capacity as well. It's very rare for them to pull it back down. It's pretty unheralded in England, I think.
Yeah.
I know Sweet 16, there was maybe one or two councils in Glasgow that got that reviewed and pulled back to a 15, but I think it's there more to protect in the other direction, but obviously it can work this way as well.
Well, the basis for it is that the BBFC, in terms of cinema classification, are an entirely voluntary classification system set up by the film industry to regulate itself. Councils ultimately have the power of controlling what is and isn't exhibited in cinemas, and that actually dates way back to legislation about fires, because films used to be incendiary in the sense that, film was highly flammable. That's why councils have the power. On DVD and video, it's completely different. The BBFC there have a legal force, but all BBFC cinema certificates are, as far as the law is concerned, completely voluntary. Actually, the responsibility ultimately lies with the councils. And as Shane rightly says, there are cases in which councils have individually overturned ratings. I mean, I was involved in the case for Last House on the Left to be played uncut with an 18 certificate. And although the BBFC balked at that and refused to give it an uncut 18 certificate, a number of councils did overturn that.
So, Tomo, are you 15 now?
Yeah.
So, do you think this is okay for 15-year-olds? I mean, what would be your thoughts on this?
Well, I think it should be a 15 because there's only, obviously there's a lot of bad language, but there's kids in school playgrounds that are shouting at each other and always smacking each other, and you see it in London and Liverpool and places like that. People get stabbed in school playgrounds, and I think it's not worthy of an 18 because of one violent scene and one racist scene. I just think it's pretty stupid that they've given it an 18 and not a 15.
Stu in Leicester says, can you ask Shane, did he think what he thought of the Oi movement and connecting bands of the 80s was part of the reason for skinheads getting a bad press?
The Oi bands were never racist bands, and I mean Captain Oi have bought the back catalogue of all of that, and that's all still available. And I know Oi bands are pretty much basically obviously don't want to be seen, and I think that's one of these sort of misconceptions that people seem to think that Oi music was race, white power band. It wasn't at all. I mean, there was I think because if you listen to the instrumentation on an Oi song and maybe on a Screwdriver record, they sound like similar, four-piece bands, and if you turn it down you might not be able to tell an enormous difference, but there was a big difference. Oi music was political, left and right-wing political, but it was never race-driven, I don't know, I think a lot of people would listen to the Oi music, and if you listen to Cock Sparrow, The Business, The Foreskins, it was aggressive music, but it was coming out of a sort of political unrest rather than racial unrest.
Nick the painter in Cambridge says the Redskins were the finest band ever, and they were socialist skins.
The Oppressed were a socialist band. You had people from either sides, but it was, like I say, it was within left and right wing. It wasn't fascist or militant,
Tomo, what's next for you, having made quite a big impact. I mean, most people haven't seen this film yet, but with the impact that this film is going to make, how do you see your future and what you're going to do next?
Well, obviously I'd like to carry on acting, and I'd like to play a different sort of character, like a good boy, and not a person that's like racist and says bad things and has to experience people getting beat up the way Milky did. And I think it'd be a bit more experience for me if I was to play a different character and not just the same.
And that teacher who turned you down for the walk-on part when you had to wave, did you have a word afterwards?
No, not really. I didn't get refused because of how I looked. It was sort of a school where I went because I was naughty in my original school, and they took me there. It's called Phoenix House, and it's for kids that it's sort of disadvantaged kids that can't behave in school. They just won't. And I went there, and they was doing a school play, and I went and I asked them, and they said, yeah, I can have it. And and it was like a week before they started, and I was naughty in lesson.
You didn't tell me that, Tom.
No, well,
You made it sound far greater than that.
He's got a great future though, Shane, hasn't he?
Oh, just a bit, yeah. I mean, it's very rare that, you know, if you imagine, you know, that people are only just about to start seeing the film. There's been a few festival screenings and things, but Tomo's, I mean, you've done 2 or 3 jobs already. He was in a TV series with Stephen Graham, and it's very rare, you know, that until people have proved themselves, if you like, and people have been to see them in the cinemas. But the word on Tomo's so good that it's got round the industry without people even seeing him in work, and they've pulled him in for auditions, and he's had 2 or 3 parts and lots of auditions already. So, you know, the future's really bright for him.
But Shane, nice to see Whizzer and Chips in a movie.
You bet. Yeah, that's my old favourite. Yeah, the Jocks and the Geordies and all of that. Loved it.
And the other, I think the moral which a lot of people will take away from the movie is don't kiss anyone with black lipstick on.
Yeah, otherwise you look like you've dived in the blueberry bush.
Yeah.
That's certainly that. Yeah, and that, I think that's, you know, again, like you know, this film is. You know, for all of the talk of obviously the racist sort of element that comes into the film, there's also a beautiful side to the film of seeing a kid grow up in the early 80s and having that first kiss at a house party, and you know, there's a lot of you know, hilarious pieces in the film as well. I don't want people to get bogged down thinking that you know, it is a rites of passage, and there are some really beautiful moments that he goes through as a kid. It's just that obviously the truth of what I saw, I couldn't lie about, and I had to be honest.
Yeah. Thomas and Shane, thanks very much indeed for talking to us.
Thank you.
Thomas and Shane, thanks very much indeed for talking to us.
Thank you.
Thomas and Shane, thanks very much indeed for talking to us.
Thank you.